So I've been learning Blender for the past 1.5 to 2 years now. And while I feel like I've come a long way, almost all of that time has been invested in becoming a texture artist. Now, I love procedural texturing. Something about using logic to be artistic and expressive really fits my personality. But as a result of my invested time, my modeling skills have been far left behind. While I do model the occasional low poly asset from time to time, I never really learned how to use the subdivision modifier to model more complex objects. My modeling skills never really got past being able to create some simple, stylized assets, but it's about time that I've changed that. Hence why I'm challenging myself to create 5 realistic weapons for this video. Now, it would be easy for me to edit my videos in such a way that would make me look like a Blender genius that doesn't suck at modeling, but that's simply not true. It's also boring and learning is fun, and I want to show you that learning process in a hopefully somewhat entertaining format. Maybe this will inspire you to open Blender and start practicing that thing that you've been neglecting lately also. I don't know. Anyway, intros are weird. So for my first attempt, I decided to follow a tutorial from a YouTuber by the name of Intuvert. I'll leave a link to that in the description. He made a Viking axe which I thought was pretty dope and achievable for someone at my skill level. I didn't want to completely copy the tutorial, so I found the neat little concept art for some axes on Pinterest that I could use and then just follow the same steps. Now, I'm not completely new to modeling, so I was able to keep up with this video pretty easily, but my first few attempts were pretty sloppy. My topology was messy and made it hard for me to work with, so I did have to restart about 2 to 3 times. On my last attempt, however, I felt it was looking a lot better. Working with the subdivision workflow did prove to be a little bit challenging, as I'm not super familiar with it just yet, but I was able to manage and get something that I was pretty happy with. Once the modeling part was done, I was ready to start sculpting. I noticed in his video he was using alpha ornaments to stamp cool patterns onto his sculpt. I thought this was a really cool idea, so I googled alpha ornaments, which led me to a website called flippednormals.com. It had a huge library of alpha ornament packs which seemed pretty fairly priced, as well as a catalogue of other things. So I picked a couple of those alpha ornament packs up and moved on to sculpting. Now, I wanted to keep it simple, so after messing with the settings and getting a feel for it, I just slapped this ornament on right here. I threw some wood grains down on the axe handle as well. From there, I UV unwrapped my low poly model, took it into Substance Painter, baked the high poly model onto it, and laid down some quick textures back in Blender. I didn't spend too much time on texturing as I wanted to focus my energy on getting better at modeling. After messing around with some textures, this is the final product. I was feeling pretty good about it and decided it was a success. So for my second weapon, it started out pretty rocky. I didn't want to follow a tutorial for this model, I just wanted to try something out on my own. I'd already done an axe, so I thought it would be nice to attempt to create a sword. I hunted around Pinterest for a bit, trying to find a cool sword that I could model. I stumbled across this sword right here and thought I'd give it a go. Now, maybe I'm just dumb, but this was way harder than I expected it to be. I'd come down with a nasty cold and was feeling pretty miserable, and I just wasn't able to figure out the topology. After a couple of failed attempts, I figured I'd put this one in the back pocket for now and focus on something else instead. I messed around with a couple of different weapon designs and wasn't feeling it until I stumbled across a halberd. Now, this isn't a sword or an axe, but it reminded me a lot of Lu Bu from Dynasty Warriors, and it brought back a lot of childhood memories, and I just couldn't pass that up. So I loaded a reference up in Blender and got to work on the halberd. It took me a couple of attempts to get the topology right, but I ended up managing. I mirrored it, gave it a sub-D modifier, and tried to apply the knowledge that I learned from the last weapon onto this one. Now, this was pretty difficult to get right. I definitely didn't do the best job. I eventually managed to get it looking acceptable though, but I knew there were some glaring issues under the hood. I didn't want to get too caught up on my errors though, otherwise I wouldn't have finished it, and my goal is to make mistakes and learn, not obsess over the little details. I threw down some alpha ornaments on them because they're honestly just so cool and I was pretty excited to use them. I didn't go too overboard though, again I'm just trying to practice and learn. I unwrapped it, took it over to Substance Painter to bake, then brought it back into Blender, slapped down some textures, and this is what I ended up with. I felt like this one was semi-successful. Okay, so you remember that sword that I attempted and failed? Well, being sick over the last week, I was in no creative or problem-solving mood. And yes, I'm going to blame it on being sick because I'm too fragile to admit that I'm bad. Anyway, I'm pretty much all better now aside from the lingering cough, and decided to give it another go. I was really struggling to get this ridge right here to have a sharp edge and have it flow seamlessly into the rest of the blade. Well, in a moment of clarity, I realized that I'm actually just an idiot. All I had to do was connect these vertices here, and like a genius, move them up just a little bit. Now, there's probably a better way to do this, but I plugged along anyway. I had a couple of shading artifacts that I wasn't too sure how to deal with, but we can just pretend they aren't there. Anyway, after modeling out the blade, I moved on to the handle. Now, this is something that I definitely would have struggled with a few days ago, but I've been messing around with the sub-D modeling outside of recording this video. And while I'm still new to this, I was able to knock this out pretty quickly, and it was a moment where I was pretty proud of myself. Again, it's not perfect, but we got to learn to walk before we can run. So I didn't do any sculpting on this weapon, so there wasn't any need to bake anything out in Substance Painter. So I jumped over to the shading tab, whipped up some textures, and marked it down as complete. Here is the final result before we move on to weapon 4. So I wanted to change it up a little bit for the 4th weapon. I knew I wanted to replicate something from a video game, but wasn't really feeling anything that I came across. But after laying in bed one night trying to fall asleep while watching Skyrim videos, I was pretty keen on trying to recreate the steel axe. And that's exactly what I did. The next morning, I loaded up a reference into Blender and started tracing it out. Following my common trend, it took me a couple of goes to get the topology right. This axe head had additional sharp edges to it, which forced me to be a little bit more mindful with how I laid out the topology. It came up looking alright in the end, and I was now faced with trying to figure out how to add the engravings. Sculpting was an option, albeit I didn't feel like it was the right path to go down. Instead, I opened up my totally legit copy of Photoshop and started drawing in the deeper sections of the engravings. The plan here is to essentially create a black and white mask, giving the edges a slight gradient, then using that mask as a normal map. This will add just a little bit of depth where the engraving should be and save me the trouble of doing a terrible sculpting job. Once that was done, I brought it over to Blender and threw it on the axe head to see how it would look. I used the Voronoi texture node to add these little punch holes, and I connected it to a bump node and threw some scratches in there as well. I got a little bit distracted with texturing the axe head as I was just vibing out listening to some good old Bill Burr podcasts. Once I finished messing around with that, I moved on to the handle. Now, I did rush through this section as I'm trying to get this video finished before I head out of town for a couple of days. I feel like I could have made this a lot better if I'd spent enough time on it, but I just wasn't too stressed. I did skip this little metal bracket thing that sits on the bottom of the handle though. Let's just say it's an artistic choice. I added the strings to the handle with a shrink wrap modifier and called it done. Finished it up with some textures, and this is how it turned out. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but I made it and I think it's pretty cool. For the 5th and final weapon, I really wanted to go all out. The only issue that I have is that me and my wife are heading out of town for a couple of days, and I really want to finish this video before I leave. So instead of finding a weapon that I would spend a full day or two on, I opted to just do another basic axe. I've been really enjoying modeling these axes as I feel like I've been getting some good practice out of them compared to the swords. I grabbed this reference right here and started tracing it out. By now, I was feeling pretty confident at making these. I didn't have to start over because of bad topology. It was mostly just fixing up little sections here and there as I progressed along. I still get these shading artifacts, and honestly, I'm not too sure how to fix them right now, but that's something that I'll look into when I get a bit more time. Again, I mirrored it, gave it a sub-D modifier, and started bracing these edges. Once all that was done, I moved on to texturing. I thought it would be a cool idea to put my textures.com subscription to use. I've been subscribed to them for so long and I've barely used them, and I figured, what the hell. I found a nice metal material that I figured would look good on the axe head, as well as a wooden image that I can use for the handle. After UV unwrapping, I slapped those textures on. I added a little bit of noise texture to the handle to dirty it up a bit more, and I wrapped up the texturing there. I quickly added some straps to the handle just to give it a little bit more detail, and I called it done. Here's the 5th and final weapon. So when I started this video, I'd honestly never used a subdivision modifier before. It's always been something that I knew was great to learn, but it was honestly intimidating. I'm glad I pushed myself to create these 5 weapons over this short period of time though, because while I still feel like my modeling skills are lacking a lot, I feel like I've really laid down some solid foundations for me to continue learning and become a better 3D artist. Instead of feeling intimidated over the thought of creating a more realistic weapon, I feel a bit more optimistic about my ability to learn. This is something that I don't want to give up, and I think I'll be practicing making weapons in my own time. It's really fun to just throw on a podcast late at night, lean back in my chair, and just create something that looks really cool. I still definitely need to get more comfortable with the sub-D modifier and put some effort into reading and learning about topology, but I still feel pretty proud that I've learned something new in these last weeks. I'd love to redo this challenge again in the future, but with guns instead, because guns are just another thing that I would love to be able to make. I also want to participate in some game jams too. I haven't done any in a really long time, and I feel like it would just be a fun video to make that from a 3D artist perspective. There's a ton of videos on game jams from programmers and such, but I feel us 3D artists are lacking in that department. So if that's something that would be interesting to you guys, let me know. Anyway, more tutorials on things that I'm actually good at coming soon. Keep learning and subscribe for more.